Hi, welcome to Terrorism, Challenges to Diplomacy and Stability. And this is Chapter 10. Oops, Chapter 10. So, chapters first starts talking about how when different states are dealing with the reality of terrorist activity, that they're going to deal with them in different ways. Okay, and each state is going to approach them differently. Sometimes each state will deal with them the same way every time. Sometimes each state will deal with them individually as each situation arises. One way that they can deal with them is the use of force. When they use of force, they have the option to use maximum use of force, suppression campaigns. Campaigns are long-term operations against terrorist cadres and their bases and their support apparatuses. They're uniquely adapted to the conditions of the terrorist environment. The military suppression campaigns, they're going to deploy military units in order to interface with the terrorist groups. Okay, so one example that they give is the case of Operation Enduring Freedom. Initially, they talk about how it was called Operation Infinite Justice. This was negatively looked at by the Muslim community, so they changed the name to Operation Enduring Freedom. This was after the 2011 terrorist attacks. We deployed units to Afghanistan. First, we realized that before doing so, we realized that this was going to be a really long campaign, and so we knew we were going to have to get a coalition of forces and not just engage with the enemy ourselves, because this was a global campaign of terror. So we went to the United Nations to seek their approval initially, and we gathered support for the campaign and got together a broad coalition of allies, and that's how we did it. Okay, later we would try to do the same thing, and for our campaign in Iraq. However, we were met with sad faces. At the time I was working at the United Nations, and nobody wanted to help us with the Iraq situation, looking for WMDs in Iraq that were not there. I recall that sitting in the General Assembly while George W. Bush was asking for permission for entry into Iraq, and everybody said no. But nonetheless, when we were looking for help going into Afghanistan, people were more than willing to help. So we knew that we needed a broad coalition of support, and we did that. We got our coalition together, and they sent their people over. there are paramilitary people, there are regular military people, and their reconnaissance, their Air Force, all of that to help us. Another example, paramilitary suppression campaigns. They gave the case of paramilitary suppression in Algeria. Just for interest of time, we're going to skip that. You can take a look at that in your book. Maximum use of force suppression campaigns, punitive strikes. These are things that states will engage in when they think that a terrorist group is going to engage in a terrorist activity. Or these are actually reprisals. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of preemptive. My bad. I'm getting ahead of myself. Punitive strikes launched as reprisals against terrorists for incidents that have already taken place. So something has happened and they are engaging in a reprisal attack. So, for example, after there was a horrible incident when ISIS was in Syria. This was back in 2014. They had captured a Jordanian pilot, I recall, and they had burned him alive in a cage, and it was all over the internet. And like the King of Jordan and some other Jordanian pilots literally got in some fighter pilot jets, some jets, and flew over to where ISIS was in Syria and bombed the heck out of them. That would be considered punitive strikes. Okay, so that was in reprisal of the terrorist act of burning one of their pilots alive. Okay, preemptive strike. That's undertaken to hurt terrorists before an incident. So if they know where terrorists are before they strike, and they take them out. Okay, that's just very obvious. Okay, so War in the Shadows, Part 1 in your book, Coercive Covert Operations. They seek to destabilize, degrade, and destroy terrorist groups. So an example would be assassinations. Okay, so an example of an assassination would be like when we assassinated Osama bin Laden. Okay, we gathered the intelligence, and Barack Obama made the executive decision to act on that intelligence, and then SEAL Team 6 went in and actually pulled the trigger and took out Osama bin Laden. Okay, and obviously when you have a well-established terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, you aren't going to destroy that kind of terrorist group. The hope is that you will at least degrade in some way the terrorist group, put a dent in them for some time to degrade some of their activities. If you cut off the head of the snake, eventually another one will grow back. They'll replace him with somebody else, and it looks like they have. One of his sons has taken his place. And that's typically the way it goes with these types of situations. Your book talks about another case, armed drone aircraft. That's very controversial. Those are, the drones that are flown without people, right? They're literal drones, okay, that are armed. that will take out either people or they could take out buildings, you know, whatever kind of target that the military is looking to take out. They're very controversial because of the fact that, one, they are not manned, and so there is this less personalized aspect of the fact that you're killing somebody. It's almost like a video game method of killing somebody that is very depersonalized. And so there's a lot of ethical debate about how this takes place, and that it's almost too easy to do. So your book talks about that, and you can look at that. Surgical use of force, operations forces, highly trained military and police units that specialize in unconventional operations. These include special forces, military units. The United Kingdom, France, Israel, and the United States all have them. Like in the United States, all branches of the military have them. You know, again, like I talked about, the SEALs who took out Osama bin Laden. Okay, those belong to the Navy. The Marine Corps has recon. The armies have the Rangers. Okay, special operations, even the police units have them. Okay, in the United States, we have like emergency search and rescue units, and in Israel they have border guards. Okay, or in the Shadows Part 2, operations other than war, repressive options. There are nonviolent covert operations that encompass a number of options that are often quite creative and are inherently secretive. So examples are infiltration, disinformation, cyber warfare, and modern surveillance technologies. They talk about that on page 214. So, hold on. So, I'm sorry. Sorry. So, disinformation, hold on, just a second. I'm just going to keep going here. So, knowing the enemy intelligence. So you have signals intelligence, and signals intelligence is things like cell phones and various sorts of satellite and communications. Sorry, my pig is sort of making noises. And human intelligence, that's things that humans gather, like through like the CIA, FBI, through spying and that sort of thing. Then you have open source intelligence. That's information that you can get online through, like Google searches or through newspapers or magazines, that kind of thing. This is something I actually used to do when I was at the United Nations, believe it or not, and I created nuclear threat assessments on North Korea using open source intelligence. And image intelligence. Image intelligence is where images are, and measurements and signatures intelligence. That's basically data type intelligence. So quantitative and qualitative type intelligence that comes in from various technical type sensors that you might get. So they analyze that. And then the geointelligence. So anything from geospatial intelligence, from maps and geographical type information. Okay. And of course, intelligence agencies, anything collected from the regular sorts of intelligence agencies that you might get. Okay, so more information can be found on page 216 to 217. Okay, hardening the target, enhanced security. Target hardening is an anti-terrorist measure that makes potential targets more difficult to attack. So again, enhanced security is also intended to deter would-be terrorists from selecting hardened facilities as targets. So basically, anything that you can do to, make the target harder for a terrorist to attack, making the security tighter, parking tighter, extra layers of security, that kind of thing is what they mean by enhancing security. So this makes it where terrorists might think twice about selecting that particular place as a target for their attack. Okay, long-term coercion, economic sanctions. So sanctions, they can serve multiple purposes. Sanctions symbolically demonstrate strong condemnation of the behavior of the sanctioned regime. Okay, so the particular government, right? Sanctions are an exercise of power of the sanctioning body. Whoever it is that's rendering the sanctions, typically it might be the United Nations. It could be a state that's offering the particular sanctions. Okay. Sanctions potentially bring to bear considerable pressure on the sanctioned regime. Typically, that pressure might come from the people themselves, meaning the people of the regime. So, because the people might feel the pressure from that, they might feel the pressure from the economic sanctions. So they might put pressure on their own regime as a result from the sanctions. And so that might cause the regime to act differently. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Okay. Reasoned dialogue. So these are conciliatory options. Diplomatic options. The use of channels of communication to secure counter-terrorist objective. Okay, so examples would be peace process or negotiations. So they might look to try to make peace with the terrorists or to engage in negotiations with the terrorists. Okay, there was like this really crazy example of a student, a PhD student, I think from Sweden, Sweden, who was a PhD student at Lund University, who was in Iraq visiting family, I think over a Christmas break, and I think was in Mosul, and ended up getting, is it Mosul or, I think it was Mosul, and ended up getting, swallowed by ISIS. And he sent a message to his PhD advisor and said, I might not be back, just letting you know, ISIS is taking over the territory. And very quietly, best PhD advisor in the universe. Best, I think she needs to win a award because she got the university to enter into negotiations with the terrorists. And they ransomed him, basically, and got him, not only him, but his entire family out and to Sweden. And so that's just an example of how a university was able to use conciliatory options with the terrorists in order to secure their safe passage. Oops. Okay. So responding to grievances, social reform. Social reform or attempts to undercut the precipitating causes of national and regional conflicts. So this would be where, the state might say, we see that there are these problems happening with a local group that among them might be, these terrorist factions. And so in order to undercut them, in order to cut them off, we will answer some of their grievances, right? And this will sort of neuter some of their issues, okay? And this is what happened in the case of the ETA in the Basque region, okay? Again, in interest of time, please take a look at page 220. Conciliatory options, giving what they want. Concessions include the following things such as payment of ransoms, like I was talking about, in relation to the student, broadcasts or other public publications of extremist propaganda, release of imprisoned comrades, political amnesty of dissidents. Case of Iran-Contra visited. You can take a look in your book. What page was that? It's page 221. Okay. So legalistic options, law enforcement and counterterrorism. So you have international cooperation as an example. There's the Interpol's probably the most famous example. That's the International Criminal Police Organization. They aren't like an arresting group, really. What they are is more of this sort of like international sort of cooperation. What they do is they gather intelligence and sort of work together internationally. And then there's the European Union equivalent, okay, which is the Europol. The police in terrorist environments. Police no longer act as law enforcement. They more act as sort of like international security, focused on patrols, okay? Sadly, they tend to be pretty repressive, okay? They are highly aggressive, little concern for human rights. Domestic laws related to counterterrorism. The book offers a couple examples, all right? In interest of time, I'm just going to quickly go over these. There were some Islamic terrorist attacks that were going on in the 1990s. By the time the worst of it ended in 1999, over 150,000 Algerians had died. Amnesty was offered around that time. They had set up special courts to prosecute these terrorists and their supporters. Okay, take a look on page 223. Qualified amnesty in Italy when they were going through in the 1970s and 80s, the Red Brigade terrorist campaigns. They had offered repentance laws. The repentance laws offered qualified amnesty to those who were willing to kind of work with the police and the courts. Okay, so have a look for more details in relation to that. International law, legalistic responses by the world community. So through like the United Nations, they have international conventions on hijacking offenses. They got together based on some hijacking incidents that had taken place. They decided to do the Hague Convention of 1970, the Montreal Convention of 1971, and say that anyone who's engaged in these activities, they're not acceptable, and these are the basic, things that all of us as countries agree that they're not acceptable, and this is what we have to say. You can take a look. Again, that was on page 224. Protecting diplomats. There were, in the late 60s and 70s, there were several attacks on some embassies, and so in response, there were laws to protect diplomats that took place. Okay, so extradition treaties. So these are done in order to sort of help nations protect each other's laws, okay? And also help to, maintain order in relation to any terrorist activities, okay? International courts and tribunals, there are several. Of course, there's the International Court of Justice, there's the International Criminal Court, and then there's a couple of special ones that were set up. There's the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda and the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So that's it. Please have a look at the e-flashcards and the web quizzes and all of that. And if you have any additional questions, please let me know. Thanks.